The atmosphere at Shinnecock was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it felt like a courtroom. Wyndham Clark lifted the US Open trophy, but the crowd didn't cheer. They booed and shouted. Some fans even got kicked out for heckling him. And just moments after Clark's victory, NBC cut the broadcast. They switched to baseball before the trophy presentation was even finished. It was strange, it was uncomfortable, and it turned out that was just the beginning. Because now, sources say NBC is threatening to pull a massive $700 million broadcasting deal. Their demand is clear. They want the USGA to strip Clark of his title. Yes, you heard that right. Strip a major champion of his victory. But here is the real question every golf fan is asking. What did Clark actually do to make a network threaten a governing body like this? The answer isn't just one thing. We aren't talking about a simple rules violation. This goes deeper into how the PGA Tour handles its biggest stars. It involves a historic venue, a locker room incident, and a controversial relief drop that left everyone confused. If the USGA caves to NBC, it sets a terrifying precedent for the sport. But if they refuse, they risk losing hundreds of millions of dollars. Clark is stuck right in the middle, but he is not innocent. His past actions at a certain historic golf club didn't exactly win him any friends. We are going to break it all down step by step, but we have to start with the moment Clark's reputation started to crack. That moment happened long before he ever teed it up at Shinnecock. What's your take on this? Do you think a major champion should ever have their title stripped over off-course drama? Drop your opinion in the comments. And if you genuinely care about the real story behind PGA Tour controversy, make sure to subscribe, because the details we are about to reveal might completely change how you see this championship. Oakmont. To understand why the 2026 US Open felt so hostile, we have to rewind 12 months. The 2025 US Open. Same major, different historic venue. Clark arrived at Oakmont with serious expectations. He was supposed to challenge for the title. Instead, he missed the cut. Brutal. But the missed cut wasn't the real story. It was what happened immediately afterward. Behind those old, respected locker room doors, Clark lost his composure in a way that stunned the club's leadership. Reports confirmed he caused significant damage to the property. This wasn't just slamming a door. This was serious enough that Oakmont, a venue with over a century of prestige, did something extremely rare. They banned him from the property entirely. Think about that. One of the most respected courses in American golf, telling a tour star he is no longer welcome. That ban didn't come with a simple warning either. Oakmont attached strict conditions. Conditions that forced Clark to answer for his actions beyond just a public apology. We will break down exactly what those conditions were in a moment. But here is where the USGA's involvement gets complicated. They were heavily involved in the disciplinary process. They collaborated with Oakmont on that decision. That means the governing body knew exactly how volatile Clark could be when the pressure gets too high. So when Clark won the very next US Open at Shinnecock, the USGA had a serious problem on their hands. Their newly crowned champion has a documented history of locker room destruction and a venue ban. That history suddenly became a ticking time bomb. And that brings us to the relief drop on the 17th hole during the third round. A decision that made fans furious and raised even more questions about whether Clark was getting preferential treatment. We will break down exactly what happened on that hole. But first, we have to answer the one question that NBC is quietly asking behind closed doors. If the USGA knew about Clark's temper and his Oakmont ban, why did they let him compete at all? The answer to that might be the most uncomfortable truth of this entire story. That decision would have been enough to destroy most people's careers, but what happened next made everything before it look minor. So let's talk about that relief drop. The moment that turned the crowd against Clark completely. It happened on the par 3 17th. Clark hit a wayward shot that ended up in a nasty spot. He called for a rules official, and after a brief discussion, he was granted free relief. Now, free relief is perfectly legal under the rules. That is not the issue. The issue is that many fans and analysts watching in real time thought the relief was extremely generous. They thought the ball was playable. They thought Clark was getting a break that other players wouldn't have gotten. The crowd started shouting. Some people were yelling things like, "Get in the bunker." Others were much more aggressive. The USGA actually had to eject multiple fans from the grounds because the heckling got so out of hand. And here is where the USGA's own rules create a massive conflict of interest. The USGA employs the officials who make these rulings. They also benefit when their broadcast partner is happy. So when a controversial call benefits the eventual champion, people start asking uncomfortable questions. Clark's response to the crowd's hostility didn't help his case either. When reporters asked him about the atmosphere after his win, he gave a surprising answer. He admitted the reaction was self-deserved. That was his exact word. Self-deserved. Think about that. A newly crowned U.S. Open champion admits the crowd was right to hate him. That single quote sent shockwaves through the golf world, because it confirmed what everyone was already starting to suspect. Clark knew he had done something wrong. He knew his reputation was damaged, and he knew that this victory felt hollow to a lot of people. The crowd had made their feelings crystal clear, but the network watching from the broadcast booth was about to make a much louder statement of their own, because NBC didn't just cut away from Clark's trophy presentation. They did something that has never happened before at a major championship. They reportedly threatened the USGA directly. Here is how it works. NBC currently pays about $93 million a year to broadcast the US Open. That is a huge amount of money, and the next deal is supposed to be even bigger. We are talking about $1 billion contract, but NBC let their exclusive negotiating window expire. That means they are not locked in. They have leverage, and they are using it. Sources suggest NBC told the USGA that if Clark remains the champion without any penalty, they will reduce their offer by around $700 million. That is not a negotiation tactic. That is a threat. And think about what that means. The broadcaster is essentially saying, we cannot sell advertising against a champion that the fans actively hate. We cannot put our brand behind a player with this kind of history. We need you to fix this problem or we will pay you less. The USGA is trapped. If they strip Clark of his title, they admit that their own event produced an illegitimate winner. That destroys their reputation forever. But if they refuse, they risk losing hundreds of millions of dollars. That destroys their business model. Either way, they lose. Clark thought his victory secured his legacy. He had no idea what NBC was already putting in motion behind the scenes. So let's go back to that Oakmont ban, because the terms of that ban are much more serious than most people realize. Oakmont didn't just say Clark was not welcome. They required him to complete 3 specific conditions before they would even consider letting him back. First, he had to pay for all the damages he caused. The exact figure was never made public, but sources describe it as significant. This wasn't a broken trash can. This was destruction that required professional repair. Second, he had to make a substantial charitable contribution, not to a vague nonprofit, to a specific organization chosen by Oakmont. They wanted him to demonstrate genuine remorse, not just write a check. Third, and most importantly, he had to complete anger management counseling, a professional program designed to help him control his temper under pressure. Oakmont essentially said, you need to prove you can handle your emotions before we will let you step foot on our property again. Now here is the part that changes everything. The USGA collaborated with Oakmont on these conditions. They were fully aware of what Clark had done. They participated in the disciplinary process. They knew he was volatile. So when Clark won the 2026 US Open, the USGA had a champion who had already been punished by another major venue for losing his temper. And they had a broadcast partner who was furious about the negative attention. The conditions were meant to be a wake-up call. Instead, they became evidence that the USGA ignored. Because if the USGA knew about Clark's history and still allowed him to compete, they are complicit. They cannot now claim to be surprised by the backlash. They cannot pretend that Clark's reputation was clean. They helped design his punishment. They knew exactly who they were dealing with. And that is why NBC's threat is so devastating. The USGA cannot defend Clark without admitting they made a mistake. They cannot strip his title without admitting their tournament was flawed. There is no clean way out. This is not about justice anymore. This is about protecting a brand. This is about keeping a broadcast partner happy. This is about money. The USGA helped build the trap. Now they are standing inside it, wondering how to escape. Let's talk about what stripping a title actually means, because there is no precedent for this. It has never happened in modern golf history. A major championship is not just a trophy. It is a permanent part of a player's legacy. It determines their place in history. It affects their sponsorships. It affects their Hall of Fame chances. It affects everything. If the USGA strips Clark's title, they are saying that the 2026 US Open never happened. The record books would show no champion for that year. Every player who finished second, third, or lower would be permanently affected. Think about that. Would the runner-up get a retroactive victory? Would everyone move up a spot? Would the purse distribution have to change? The logistical nightmare alone is enough to make the USGA hesitate. But here is the thing. NBC doesn't actually expect the USGA to strip the title. That is not the goal. The threat is leverage. The threat is pressure. The goal is to make the USGA look like they are doing something. Remember, this is a negotiating tactic. NBC wants a better deal. They want the USGA to understand that they cannot sell a controversial product. They need the USGA to clean up Clark's image, or at least make it look like they are trying. The title strip was never the real threat. The real threat was making the USGA look weak. So what is the USGA actually going to do? The smart money is on something in between. They will not strip the title. That is almost certain. The legal and financial fallout would be catastrophic. Clark would sue. His sponsors would sue. The entire foundation of major championship golf would crack. But they will also not do nothing. They have to show NBC that they are taking the situation seriously. They have to demonstrate that they can protect the integrity of their broadcast partnership. So the most likely outcome is a formal reprimand, a public statement acknowledging Clark's past behavior and outlining steps he must take to maintain his eligibility. They might require him to complete the Oakmont conditions publicly. They might suspend him from future USGA events for a period of time. They might impose new conduct rules that apply to all players going forward. Clark's title is safe, but his reputation and his future in the game are not. And that is where this story leaves us, stuck in a gray area between what should happen and what will happen. The fans have spoken. The crowd at Shinnecock did not accept Clark as a worthy champion. They booed. They heckled. They made their feelings unmistakable. The broadcast partner has spoken. NBC has made it clear that they will not pay top dollar for a product that feels tainted. They want a champion that advertisers can get behind. The USGA is caught in the middle. They have to balance tradition, business, and fairness. And so far, they have not shown any ability to do that well. Clark himself seems to understand the situation. He admitted the reaction was self-deserved. He knows he made mistakes. He knows his past is catching up with him. But he also knows that his victory is valid. He played the course. He made the shots. He lifted the trophy. That victory will always have a question mark next to it. And that might be the punishment that actually hurts the most. Because at the end of the day, stripping a title is not the worst consequence. The worst consequence is having a title that no one respects. Having a victory that fans will always question. Having a legacy that will forever have an asterisk. Clark won the US Open, but he will never be celebrated for it the way other champions are. And in a strange way, that might be exactly what NBC wanted all along. They didn't need the title stripped. They just needed it tainted enough that the conversation around it never quite feels clean. And they got exactly that. So what happens next? The USGA will likely announce some kind of disciplinary action in the coming weeks. They will try to balance the scales without going too far. Clark will continue to play, NBC will continue to negotiate, and the fans will continue to argue about whether any of this matters. But one thing is clear. The relationship between broadcasters and golf tournaments has permanently changed. Networks are no longer just passive partners. They are active stakeholders who will use their leverage to shape the product they sell. The real story here was never about Wyndham Clark. It was about who actually controls the game. That is the uncomfortable truth that everyone is avoiding. The fans think they control the game through their passion. The players think they control the game through their performance. The USGA thinks they control the game through their rules. But NBC just showed everyone that the real power belongs to whoever writes the biggest check. And right now, that is not the fans. That is not the players. That is not the USGA. That is the broadcast partner with a $700 million threat. Do you think NBC crossed a line by threatening the USGA, or did they have every right to protect their investment? And if you follow this stuff week after week, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss what happens next, because this story is far from finished.